Welcome back to our study of the greatest sermon ever preached, the Sermon on the Mount. We're in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 13. Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth. And if salt has become tasteless, how will it be made salty again? It is good for nothing anymore, except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men." Notice how Jesus is saying, you're the salt of the earth. What does he mean when he compares Christians to being salt? Well, first of all, one of the things about salt is that it saves and preserves. Salt is something that was used in the ancient world. They would pack meat in salt, and that would help keep the meat from spoiling too quickly. Well, Christians are those that can save and preserve. We are the kind of people that we help the world from just plunging into complete and total corruption. Well, if we're not being salty, if we're not being that kind of influence, then what is going to stop the world from just plunging into total sinfulness and corruption? Well, nothing. Christians are the difference makers when it comes to that. Secondly, salt is something that spreads and permeates. When we think about the idea of leaven and in the area of cooking, well, salt is that which is used as something that will spread and permeate whatever it is put in as far as cooking is concerned. Well, so also should Christians be the kind of people that through our desire to preach the gospel to the whole world, Matthew 28:18 through 20, to follow the Great Commission, we are going to be that which spreads and permeates the world. You know, Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 that apparently the church at Corinth thought that Paul basically wanted them to pull out of being with the world when he said, do not associate with immoral people. And he said, I'm talking about immoral people in the church. I'm not talking about the world, because then you would have to go out of the world, and it's kind of hard to evangelize if everybody lives in as a monk in a monastery somewhere. Well, we need to be the kind of people that spreads and permeates. Salt also is that which adds taste and appeal. Now, I don't know about you, but I like to put salt on a lot of food that I eat. It makes it taste better. Christians should be the kind of people that make the world a better place. Someone said, how many atheists do you know that have built hospitals? Well, most of the hospitals were built by people that had at least a general sense of a Christian base. We are the kind of people that need to be the influence for the world. I remember one time I was driving down a street, and there was a pickup truck that had a bumper sticker on it that said, Christians are only good to be shot and killed. And first of all, it was shocking to see that. I wasn't even sure whether that was legal, that you could say something that overtly. Maybe in today's world you can. But I was also thinking that if that guy had a breakdown, I'd be the one that would stop to help him. If he needed a ride, then I would be the one to provide him a ride. If he needed some help getting his truck repaired, then I would come up with the financial resources to help him. Why? Because I'm a Christian. If his wife was stranded in some remote place, I would take care of her, and he could trust her with me. Christians are not the problem in our world. Christians are the solution to the problems in the world. And so when Jesus is saying, you're the salt of the earth, The entire planet is supposed to be one that is influenced by Christianity. That Christians are the ones that make the world a better place, make it taste better, make it a place that has the advantages of safety and civility and all of the benefits that we have with Christianity. So salt saves. And that's what we are supposed to be doing. The church is a soul-saving institution. We are to be bringing the gospel to the world. So nothing can save salt if the salt has lost its saving power. Anything that will not do what it was made for, not worth anything. And so Jesus is saying, you're the salt of the earth. Now, if salt has no longer the elements that make it valuable, it's good for nothing. Just throw it out. Well, what good is a Christian that is making no difference in the world? Is not influencing, is not making the world a better place, is not trying to save souls? Well, Jesus is saying in very blunt and straightforward language, they're good for nothing. So we think about the idea that we are salt. Second, we think about what that means as far as my life. Am I someone that has made the world a better place? That I'm saving and preserving, that I'm spreading the good news of Jesus Christ, that I'm making the world a better place for the people that I encounter, my neighbors and friends and co-workers. If not, then of what value am I to God and His kingdom? And then also we recognize the universality of the statement. You are the salt of the earth. Boy, talk about setting the bar high there, Jesus. But you're the salt of the earth. There's no limit to the scope of influence that Christians are supposed to have. And then he said, you are the light of the world. Again, notice how Jesus is talking about the universality of this. You're the salt of the earth. You're the light of the world. Well, there again is showing the scope of the kind of influence that we're supposed to have. He says, a city set on a hill cannot be hidden. When we think about our being light, Jesus wants us to be that which is the light for all. Now, when we look at this metaphor, you're to be a light. Light is a representative of truth, holiness, and purity. So when Jesus says you're to be a light, what exactly does that mean? That people can look at you and see purity, holiness, truth being manifested in your life. You practice what you preach. You live as a Christian should live. And when you're doing those things, you are a light for the world. We also recognize that light is needed to guide us. Just like David said in Psalm 119, that God's word is a light and a lamp to my feet, to my path. We need light in order to get to where we are going. And so if we're the light of the world, we are providing them light so they can see their way to heaven. They can follow us, that we are illuminating the way to making it to God, to heaven. Jesus says in verse 15, nor do men light a lamp and put it under a peg measure, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all those who are in the house. What sense does it make to light a lamp and then put something over it that is going to take out the light? Why even light it if that's what you're going to do with it? So why would a Christian who considers themselves to be a light then do things that are going to keep them from radiating that light to others? Jesus is talking about the person that basically is incognito as a Christian. They don't do anything that would let other people know that they're a Christian. There is nothing distinctive about them. They act like they're one of the gang, one of the people in the workplace. Well, that's putting a cover, that's putting that basket over the light and drowning out the light. So he says very clearly, verse 16, let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. I believe we need to make this point, and there is a big difference between shining your light and letting your light shine. When we get to chapter 6, we're going to talk about those people that are standing on the street corners and they're doing all these things to be seen of men. Well, that would be wrong. That would be sinful. That would be arrogant and prideful. And Jesus is going to clearly condemn that sort of thing in chapter 6. But here he's talking about you're not trying to hide who you are. Your loyalty to Jesus is one that is on open display. You're not trying to hide it. And so when all your co-workers are sitting there and they're digging right into lunch, they look at you and you're praying. You're not trying to be showy, but you're being true to who you are. Or you go to a restaurant, you're going to say that prayer. Or maybe during a break time, you're reading your Bible. Well, let your light shine before men. You're not doing it so they'll see it, but you're doing what Christians do. Christians pray. Christians study their Bible. Christians are those who are kind to others, are considerate to others. And so you're just living the Christian life. And while you're in the process of living the Christian life, there are going to be people that will notice what it is that you're doing. So you're letting your light shine. You're not trying to hide who you are, but you're also not announcing it on the street corners either. You see the distinction between those two things? Because that is what Jesus is saying. We are commanded here to let our light shine before men so they may see your good works. They need to see what it is that we're doing, those good works. Not that they're going to glorify us, because as soon as we cross that line where we're doing what we're doing because we want the attention from others, then it's become sinful. But when we're doing it and people don't glorify us, but they glorify God, that's our ultimate goal. That is what we want. So let your light shine. You know, I remember one time being very discouraged in a church I was preaching for because I was thinking I was the only one that was ever doing anything. And so in one particular sermon, I said, brothers, sisters, you're not doing what's right. I'm the only one in this church that seems to be doing anything. And well, as I was standing in the back and shaking everybody's hands as they were leaving the building, I had one sweet little sister say, well, preacher, I send cards to everybody that misses on Sunday. I said, you do? She said, yeah. And I had another sister come by and she said, well, I call everybody that isn't here just to make sure that they're okay. You do? And then I had one brother said, well, preacher, I give bags of groceries to various families that are hurting in the community, and I always put a track in there and say that this bag of groceries is coming from the Church of Christ. You do? Well, with each one of these people that were coming by, another brother said, I've got 2 Bible studies going right now. You do? Well, I became smaller and smaller with every one of these stories. But my point is, I was so encouraged when I heard about what other people were doing. They were not letting their light shine. They were kind of keeping what they were doing in secret, when I wasn't going to glorify them, but glorify God for what they were doing, and it was such an encouragement to me. So Jesus is saying, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good works. It's all has to do with attitude. We don't need incognito Christians. We don't need undercover Christians. We need Christians that are putting themselves out there. They're living the Christian life. They're doing what Christians do. And it's no secret who they are. They're not trying to keep it secret. They're letting their light shine. They're letting people see their good works. And then God is receiving the glory for those things. So our goal then is to cast the light upon God, to bring people to God, to glorify Him, not us. Because, as Jesus is going to say in chapter 6, if they glorify us, then we've received our reward, and it no longer has any credit with God for what we have done. Matthew 5, verse 17, Jesus says, "Do not think that I came to abolish the law." Now, if you were following it all when I was talking about the Beatitudes, I started out by saying each one of the Beatitudes had a surprise. And that surprise is that Jesus was pushing against the status quo. He was pushing against the theological thinking of the religious leaders. And so why would he suddenly say, "Do not think I came to abolish the law," if in fact he had not already said some things that people are going, he's not exactly lining up with our religious teachers. Plus, where he is about to go is really going to be an illustration of this, because Jesus is going to go through 6 contrasts of what you have heard that it was said, but I say to you. And most of the "you have heard that it was said" is going to be quotations from the old law, which the Pharisees had kind of twisted and misapplied those 6 areas. And so Jesus is dealing with what he had already said, but he is also setting them up for what he is about to say, where someone's going to come around and say, "This guy's trying to do away with the law." Don't think, Jesus says, that I came to abolish the law of the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. All right, so Jesus is saying the law still has value, and to accuse him of not giving the impression that the law still has value is to completely miss what Jesus is saying. He's not wanting to throw it away, abolish it. And in Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 15, Paul says that Jesus came to abolish the law. Well, that's not the same word, and that's a different point that Paul is making than what Jesus is making here. Even though the New American Standard uses the word abolish in both places, it's not the same word and not the same idea. But Jesus is saying that he came to fulfill. This is the word pleroo, fulfill. And what it means is to bring to its logical conclusion, to wrap it up. The law was not intended to be something that was going to last until the end of time. The law was something, for example, Paul would explain in Galatians chapter 3, was to bring us to Christ. It was that tutor to lead us to Christ. Well, Jesus is saying, I'm not abolishing it, but I am bringing it to its natural conclusion, which was what it was designed for all along, to fulfill it. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass away from the law until all is accomplished. Jesus is saying the law is so valuable, it is so important, that everything that it said that was going to happen is going to happen. Not the smallest letter, not the smallest stroke of a letter. All is, in fact, going to be accomplished. When Jesus said on the cross, "It is finished," there are some scholars that have said that Jesus recognizes that his life is about over. And that's what he means. My life is almost finished. But in actuality, Jesus was saying that he had now fulfilled everything that needed to be fulfilled about him in the law. And so his words could literally be, "It is accomplished." Jesus had fulfilled the old law, had wrapped up everything that the old law said was going to happen to the Messiah. There's one other kind of side point, if you will allow me to deviate for just a minute. Jesus' view of inspiration is something that is seen in the phrase that not the smallest letter or stroke of a letter. The smallest letter in the Hebrew alphabet was what was called a yod, Y-O-D, and it was about as big as a comma that we would write in English. And then the stroke of a letter, they would have little tiny extensions. Maybe you've seen someone write the letter A, and at the end of the A it had a little kind of a loop. Well, that's what Jesus means by a stroke of a letter. Well, those pen strokes make letters. Letters make words. Words make sentences. Sentences make paragraphs. Paragraphs make chapters. Chapters make books. Jesus is saying every pen stroke of the law is going to be fulfilled. That's what is called plenary verbal inspiration, word for word inspiration. Literally everything that was said in the Bible is that which is from God, and not any of it is going to pass away without it being fulfilled, because it is the Word of God. So if you view the Bible the way Jesus viewed the Bible, then you understand that every word is that which is inspired of God. Paul says as much in 2 Timothy chapter 3 in verse 16 when he says all Scripture is inspired of God. The word Scripture is the Greek word graphe, and it means that which is written down is inspired of God. All right, so that which is written down, that's the same as Jesus's the smallest letter or stroke of a letter. It's all inspired of God, and it is all going to be accomplished. Jesus says, verse 19, "Whoever then annuls one of the least of these commandments, and so teaches others, shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever keeps and teaches them shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven." Those of you that have a King James or a New King James will notice that the translation there has the word break. Whoever then breaks one of the least of these commandments. The Revised Standard, the ESV, uses the word relax, which is a much better word. Here's why. Think about if the word break is the correct word here. Jesus is saying you can break the commandments of God and still make it to heaven. You'll be called least, but you're still going to make it to heaven. That completely contradicts what Jesus is going to say in so many other places. You see, the rabbis counted 613 commands in the Mosaic Law. And what they did is they made some more important than others. They ranked them. And so this was the most important, and then all the way down. Well, Jesus is saying that one will still be in the kingdom even if they were guilty of doing what the rabbis did in exalting some commandments over others. But they still, the rabbis taught, you need to obey all 613. You can't pick and choose which ones you're going to obey and not obey. So the King James, New King James, is not accurate here. Jesus is simply saying that those who have made some commandments more important than others, they've ranked them, but they still try to obey all of them, are going to still make it to heaven. But they're not going to be as praised by God. Again, notice how this seems to suggest degrees of reward in heaven. They're going to be called least. Well, that means there's someone that's going to be called great. And Jesus already talked about who's going to be called great in the kingdom of heaven. But these are people that should not have prioritized God's commands. Here is a good lesson for us today. There are some people that they judge the importance of commands of God on the number of times God says something about it. And we have heard this particular argument with instrumental music, for example, that if instrumental music was all that important to God, then we would have had more than Ephesians 5:19 to talk about it. But Jesus is saying, in effect, how many times does God need to say something for it to be considered law to us, to be considered important to us? Well, I hope that your answer is he just needs to say it once, and that's all it takes. That's the way a righteous person views the commandments of God. God doesn't need to say it over and over again. He just needs to say it once. And we as children of God, wanting to serve God, are going to take every command that God gives and do our best to obey that command and not exalt one command over another command. Let's not be guilty of doing that. Let's not be guilty of putting commands above other commands, except when Jesus has told us that the greatest command is the love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is likened to it, you love your neighbor as yourself. If Jesus can rank the commands, but that's not our job. We need to obey the commands from that point on. We have said that it's a sermon, the Sermon on the Mount is a sermon about righteousness. And so it is. Now we're going to get to what might be considered the central idea, the main idea of the Sermon on the Mount. This is where it all comes together, and Jesus states as clearly and as powerfully as it can be said. For I say to you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. Have you ever thought about how that particular statement might have resonated among the multitude that's listening? Because the scribes and Pharisees were the ultimate of the religious elite. They were considered the most holy of all. They were the epitome of what a spiritual person was supposed to be like. They dressed the part, they looked the part, they talked the part. Well, and then Jesus comes on the scene and says, you have to do a whole lot better than those guys, or you're not going to make it. Well, if you're going to have to do better than them to make it, then what does that say about their making it? Well, they're not going to make it. So Jesus said in not so veiled terms, these scribes and Pharisees that you're putting on this pedestal, they're not even going to make it. They're not going to make it to the kingdom of heaven. You're going to have to do a lot better than they are doing. So it's a sermon about righteousness. Jesus is saying you're going to have to do better. Now, it's not assumed that the people are going to even know what that means. How are we to do better than they? Well, Jesus is going to walk them through 6 contrasts. The contrast is the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees versus the righteousness of God, which here I'm referring as true righteousness. Jesus can tell us what a truly righteous person is like, as opposed to the righteousness described by the scribes and Pharisees. Note the pattern that we have in these 6 contrasts. Jesus will start each one with the phrase, "You have heard," generally referring to parts of the old law, which also reveals that these people did not read the scrolls, the Old Testament books, with their own eyes. That what they knew about the Bible was what they had heard the scribes and Pharisees tell them about the Bible. And then the contrast is Jesus will say, "But I say to you," you've heard the scribes and Pharisees say this, "but I say this." So Jesus is showing authority. It's a kind of powerful teaching that so impressed the multitude that if you look at chapter 7 and verse 28, the result was when Jesus had finished these words, the multitudes were amazed at his teaching. Now notice this, for he was teaching them as one having authority and not as their scribes. You see, Jesus said, "You've heard, but I say this." You see, the rabbis of the day they made their mark by their ability to quote other rabbis. And when you read writings like the Mishnah is just regurgitating what various rabbis had said. And so the most impressive of all the rabbis were the guy who could say, "And Rabbi ben Yehuda say," and then Rabbi ben Joseph say, and then Rabbi ben, and he just could quote after quote after quote what these various rabbis said. But then Jesus comes on the scene, they're expecting more of the same. And he said, "You've heard them say this, but I say this." He's showing the kind of authority. Remember in Matthew 17 on the Mount of Transfiguration, you've got Moses, Elijah, and Jesus. And then Moses and Elijah disappear. Jesus is there alone, and the voice comes from heaven saying, "This is my beloved Son, hear ye him." No longer listening to Moses, no longer listening to Elijah and the prophets. Hear him. Well, Jesus said, "You've heard that it was said, but I say to you." So he is showing that authority. All right, so let's look at these contrasts. The very first one, I just put in the general category of anger. "You have heard that the ancients were told, 'You shall not commit murder,' and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court." All right, we know that in Exodus 20 and verse 13, the 10 Commandments, "Thou shalt not kill." And so the rabbis certainly taught that. But what they did was they applied the letter of the law to, you cannot take a life, and if you take a life, then your life is going to be taken. But God didn't say anything about not being angry, and so you could go ahead and be angry, just don't kill anybody. Well, with that kind of philosophy, there was unbridled anger, and they felt like they were completely justified in being angry. But Jesus talks about 3 levels of increasing anger. "But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. Whoever shall say to his brother, 'Raca,' shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. And whoever shall say, 'You fool,' shall be guilty enough to go into the hell of fire." Each one of these is someone that is spiraling more and more out of control with his anger. The first one is kind of a silent anger. Well, you're going to be guilty before the court, is just the general idea of a law court. Whoever shall say to his brother, "Raca," Raka is an Aramaic word that basically means that you are a good for nothing. You are complete waste, an embarrassment to the human population. Well, you're going to be guilty before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was what was known as the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin had 70 members of both Pharisees and Sadducees that made up the Sanhedrin, and then it was ruled by the high priest, and if there was ever a tie, 35-35, he would make the deciding vote one way or the other. Then the third, he says, whoever shall say, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into the hell of fire. Well, this is language that we kind of throw around a lot today, and so that doesn't sound all that bad to me. But in the first century world, you need to understand that this was as derogatory and insulting language as could be said. And so for us to make a modern application, we would need to come up with terms today that are offensive to everybody. You are really denigrating the person. You're condemning them to eternity in hell, pronouncing a judgment upon them. And now this person is just spewing venom. They are so unbridled anger that they are saying the most hateful things that you can imagine. Well, Jesus says that kind of person with that unbridled anger is guilty enough to go into the hell of fire. There's a very famous preacher today that said, in my church, you will never ever hear the word hell spoken. Well, then apparently you're not preaching Jesus, because Jesus here uses the word hell in other places as well. Jesus believed in hell, talked about hell, and he certainly here is saying there are going to be people that are going to go there. And the people that are going to go there in this particular text are those that do not know how to control their anger. If therefore, and then verse 23 and 24, he's moving to a different level of anger. Be proactive in settling disputes. It said, if therefore you are presenting your offering at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar, and go your way. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come out and present your offering. Yes, the Bible does teach that there are some things more important than worship. And you are about to engage in worship, but you remember that there's a problem between you and your brother, and really it's his problem, but you're not to take the attitude of it's his problem. He needs to be the one. If he's got something against me, then he needs to be the one that's proactive. But Jesus says, no, you need to be the one that is proactive in reaching out to him. Leave your gift at the altar, go make reconciliation, and then come back and worship. Do we know people that have something against us? Then we shouldn't let it ride. We should be one that is proactive in trying to get that anger that they have taken care of and hopefully eliminated altogether. Then in verse 25 and 26, he wants to talk about the logic of controlling your tongue. Make friends quickly with your opponent at law while you are with him on the way, in order that your opponent may not deliver you to the judge and the judge to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. Truly I say to you, you shall not come out of there until you have paid the last cent. All right? Picture of the ancient world where there were relatively few roads that would have led to Jerusalem, where the court was going to be. And so the likelihood of your meeting the person that you got a legal dispute with on that road, you're both walking, It was a legitimate possibility. And so Jesus is saying, make friends quickly with him on the road. Now, if you've got anger that you're not controlling, you're going to tell that person off. You're going to say, shame on you for dragging me to the court, and you're no good, and so. And well, then by the time you get before the judge, he is ready to throw the book at you. He is ready to bring the full weight of the law on you. Well, your own anger and your inability to control that anger and your words is what gets you into trouble. And Jesus says, in effect, and you deserve every bit of it. Whatever he ends up doing to you, you could have, with a calmer, peaceful, make friends quickly attitude, you might have solved the problem where before you even got to court, the guy's saying, let's just forget this whole thing. Well, because you controlled your emotions, you controlled your anger, you controlled your words. Otherwise, he's going to throw you into jail, and Jesus says, and you're going to stay there until you've paid up the last cent. Well, you didn't make money in prison in biblical times, like prisoners today can make money. And so how were you going to pay off a debt if you're in jail and you can't make any money? Well, unless you've got a rich uncle, you're going to be there a long time. So your anger got you there, and you deserve to be there. So with this first contrast, Jesus is saying, you have heard that it was said, don't kill anybody. But I'm saying, don't be angry. Control your anger. And how often do we see road rage, various demonstrations of anger today? Well, it happens a lot. And maybe it's something that you struggle with. Jesus here is saying, if you're truly going to be righteous in the eyes of God, you are, in fact, going to control your anger. All right, that's the first contrast. When we come back, we'll be ready to look at contrast number 2. Thanks again.